All right, welcome everybody to this CCRI seminar. Hopefully you're in the right place. The title is The Challenges of Co-Designing Policy and Co-Producing Social Evidence, Examples from Fisheries. And before I go into the presenters, I'm just going to let you know it's being recorded. That might have implications later on if you want to say anything in the chat, but just to let you know that's being recorded. Everyone should be muted through the presentations, please. And then at the end of each presentation, we'll stop and review the chat box because we're asking people to put their questions there, since that's an easier process. We've got Julie Urquhart and Matt Reed to give us two presentations drawing on their recent experiences in two separate projects. I'll leave them to explain the context and the background of this, and hand you over to Matt. Sorry, Julie, who's going to start, and then Matt will follow. Sorry,
yeah,
Matt. Good.
I'll start. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. As Julie said, I'm Julie Urquhart, Senior Research Fellow at the CCRI. I'm an environmental social scientist, and I've been working on fisheries-related research for over 10 years now, focusing on mainly the social and cultural aspects of fisheries, often reflecting on small-scale fisheries. But what I want to do in this presentation today is to reflect on learnings from a number of projects that we've been working on over the past few years for DEFRA that have adopted a participatory and co-design approach to thinking about fisheries. I'm going to talk more broadly about the benefits and challenges of participatory approaches and co-design and interactive governance perspectives to fisheries management. And then Matt's going to zoom in a bit and talk a bit more specifically about a particular project that we worked on that looked at participation of commercial and recreational fishers in science and management. So that's kind of the backdrop to the two presentations today. And I just wanted to start really by setting the scene about the context of fisheries. Now, the coming decades are going to be very critical for fisheries. We're seeing declining fish stocks and climate change, and this is all threatening the sustainability of those marine resources. This is going to have massive impacts on fish populations, on marine ecosystems and habitats, on coastal communities and those local economies, and also on human health and well-being. But that being said, there's been some recent work that's looked at the potential to rectify this, and it suggested that marine ecosystems have the potential to recover by 2050 if the major pressures on them are mitigated very soon. But to try and achieve this, it will require an integrated approach to governance that can deal with the complexity and the uncertainty of fisheries' social ecological interactions. So fisheries in the UK are very diverse. Capture fisheries involve both commercial and recreational fishing. The commercial sector includes a very wide range of vessels, right the way through from large super trawlers that operate offshore for up to weeks at a time and can catch vast quantities, tons and tons of fish at a time, right the way through down to very small vessels of under 10 metres that go out on a daily basis with perhaps one, maybe two crew. They catch just kilos of fish a day and are very limited in what they can do by the weather and the tides. The other point to make is the different sorts of gear across the different sectors. So fisheries involves lots of different gear types, from mobile, static gear, with mobile gear consisting of trawl nets and dredges and drift nets, and static gear could be bottom set gill nets, long lines, pots and traps. And all these different types of gear are used to target different fish or shellfish species. The recreational fleet is also very diverse. They target different species, and they can involve both shore-based and boat-based activity, including charter angling, and that generally occurs close to the shore. Currently fisheries in the UK are currently managed and governed by the EU Common Fisheries Policy, and under this, total allowable catches are set every year at EU level in December for every member state. And then the member states, the European countries, they allocate quota to different sectors of fisheries within their country, and that's their responsibility to do that. In the UK, the quota is allocated differently across 3 sectors, and that's the under 10 metre vessels, producer organisations, and this is mainly over 10 metre vessels, and then the third is the larger non-sector vessels. They're the larger vessels that don't belong to a producer organisation. And I think it's also, in terms of context, it's important to note that about 80% of the fish that is caught by UK fishing vessels is exported. Much of this goes to Europe, but it also goes further afield than that. But how we manage fisheries in the UK is going to change, and probably quite dramatically as the UK leaves the EU. The Fisheries Bill is currently going through the House of Commons, and this bill sets the legal mandate that will allow the UK to operate as an independent coastal state. It will end the automatic rights for EU vessels to fish in British waters, and will give the UK the opportunity to set its total allowable catch. That being said, there's likely to be negotiations regarding quota trading that may allow other nations to fish in UK waters, as currently happens. The aim of the Fisheries Bill is to ensure fisheries are sustainable. It aims to contribute to food security, to allow the fishing sector to thrive, and to contribute to a levelling up of coastal communities, which are often quite deprived, and also to ensure social and cultural well-being. And what's interesting is in the Fisheries Bill and the Fisheries White Paper, there is a clear recognition that the industry itself needs to take greater responsibility and have a greater say in how those fisheries are managed and governed. And this would include fishers in co-managing resources, in engaging in science partnerships, and in co-designing policy. And this is a very clear ambition within the Fisheries Bill, but currently how that will look, what that would look like and what that will involve is still quite unclear. So the aim is to move to more participatory forms of governance, and this represents a real step change actually from the traditional approaches to how fisheries have been governed. So traditionally they've taken a very top-down, a centralised command and control approach to fisheries governance, and this really stems from Hardin's tragedy of the commons model, that suggests that for common pool resources like fisheries, individuals are going to seek to maximise their own gain rather than seeking to conserve the resource for the collective good. So therefore the view with that in mind is that they need to be centrally managed and regulated in order to conserve the resource. But this approach hasn't really worked. It hasn't worked in fisheries. It hasn't led to sustainable behaviours. It can't account for regional and local variation, and it's unable to navigate the conflicts and trade-offs between commercial fisheries and other activities. And as a result of that, we're still seeing habitat destruction, the over-exploitation of fish stocks, threats to livelihoods, food security and well-being. So there's a real need here for a more multi-level interactive form of governance that would help to facilitate cooperation and group decision making, building more on Ostrom's paradigm that actually communal groups can actually come together to co-develop rules and guidelines to manage resources in a sustainable way.
Julie, can I
Yep.
just interrupt you for 1 minute? Can you go onto full screen? Your notes are showing at the moment.
Oh, okay. I am on full screen.
If you,
I think it's because I've got my other screen.
I can't control it, and there are 3 dots underneath. I'm not sure what your screen is you're seeing. Can you see 3 dots underneath the screen?
No.
The slide? No.
No,
okay.
I can't see that. Let me try. I don't think you'll see this now, will you? No.
We can still see it.
Oh, can you?
Yeah.
Hannah suggests maybe swap your screens around.
Yeah. Can you see that now?
Still with your notes.
Still with the notes.
There's helpful comments in the chat. You can tell Zoom which screen to use as your main screen.
Yeah, it might take me ages to figure that
okay.
out.
Well, if you're okay carrying on.
It's fine, isn't it?
Is that okay?
It's okay, yeah. I wondered if it was an easy option. You carry on. Sorry to disrupt it.
Hang on, I've got to get it back now. It's that doesn't seem to be working at all now. Oh, yeah,
we can see.
You can see it. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Okay, so what is interactive governance? So interactive governance is a form of democratic governance that involves communities very early in the process of policy formulation and also implementation. It actually goes beyond traditional approaches to participation that generally tend to be around informing or consultation. So it's more about co-designing policies and management in the very early stages and taking a shared responsibility. So it's more about doing with rather than doing to. And to achieve this, interactive governance recognises that no one actor is going to have complete knowledge in order to effectively manage the social ecological system. It recognises that different actors have different forms of knowledge, and all of those knowledges are important and valid. They're just different. So scientific knowledge is not seen as more important than fisher knowledge. Both are valued equally. And so interactive governance also recognises a need for knowledge to be co-produced. It also distinguishes between first and second orders of governing, which is quite important. First order governance refers to the day-to-day activities associated with managing. So this might be, in terms of fisheries, it might be identifying different sorts of technical measures to reduce impact of gears. And then the second order levels of governance might relate more to the institutions that frame and regulate behaviour. So that could be things like allocating quota across the different segments of the fleet. And what's important to note here is that interactive governance goes across both first and second order levels. So achieving co-management isn't without its challenges, and over recent years, the last 2 to 3 years, we've worked on a number of projects for DEFRA that have sought to deepen understanding about what the principles of co-design and co-management might look like and how we might go about achieving that. And in the next few slides, I want to draw on our experiences of those projects to think about both the barriers, the challenges of undertaking co-management, but also what the potential opportunities and the benefits of that might be, and how we might start to build a framework for achieving successful co-design for fisheries co-management and policy co-design. So firstly, one of the big challenges, I think, for co-management is that it requires a shift in power relations. So it requires the policymakers to relinquish some of the power that they have over decision making, but it also requires stakeholders to take on some of that responsibility. So there is a shift in power across both policy and stakeholders. But it can be really difficult to get stakeholders to participate due to these very ingrained feelings of mistrust and disenchantment with policy and with the authorities, which we've come across in the projects that we've undertaken. And also there can be conflicts between stakeholders themselves. So different stakeholders might have different needs and different values and different ideas about how things should be managed. So managing those conflicts as well, and the trade-offs between those stakeholders, can be quite challenging. The other point is that any co-management needs to be undertaken in a very open and transparent manner. So policy needs to policymakers need to be very clear about what the outcomes of any co-design might be and what that might be used for. So in some of the work that we've done, there can be an assumption on the part of stakeholders that any outcomes from the co-design process might lead to reducing their fishing rights if it's not clear about how the outcomes are going to be used in the policy making context. The other point is that doing co-management and co-design does take a lot of time and a lot of resources. It's not a quick fix, and it's not an easy thing to do. And it can be very difficult to make sure that all stakeholders are included, especially those that are hard to reach and those that rarely have a voice. So there needs to be quite a concerted effort to make sure that the correct stakeholders are included. But the benefits, sorry Judy.
Sorry to interrupt again, the slides don't seem to be changing over. We are still seeing slide about interactive governance.
Oh right.
Not the challenges one.
Let me try it. I'll stop and I'll start again.
Okay.
Apologies for this.
We're all learning.
Right, can you see that now?
Yes, not full screen. We're on the slide 8.
Yep, you can see that now?
And if it's a co-management, yes.
Yes, okay, good. Okay, so despite all the challenges, co-management and policy co-design can bring real benefits. And some of the recent work undertaken by the Future of Inshore Fisheries, which involved a 2-day conference with about 150 fisheries stakeholders last year, identified a real appetite across both policy and industry for working towards co-management. And we found this also in the recent projects that we've undertaken, that despite their initial skepticism, stakeholders recognise the benefits of engaging in co-management and co-design, and also there was recognition from the policy side of things that industry knowledge and experience can really inform fisheries management decisions. And it can also improve uptake of management measures if they're collaboratively agreed upon with those that they're going to most impact. Co-management can also contribute to a greater sense of collective ownership and responsibility on behalf of stakeholders, rather than just following the rules. And this can lead to building trust and respect and tolerance, because it allows those actors to learn about the perspectives and values of other stakeholders and actors who might think differently to themselves, and they might have different needs and priorities. So it can really help to improve those relationships and to achieve more equitable outcomes. And I just wanted to share very briefly some of the work that we've done around designing a framework for co-designing a social survey of fishers, and to think about how that might be applied more generally. For this project, our brief was to undertake a feasibility study for a social survey of fishers that would be co-designed between policymakers and stakeholders to ensure that any data collected would be relevant to both parties. And the framework that we developed was built on a period of engagement with both policy and fisheries stakeholders in a participatory exercise. The outcome of that was this framework that we developed, which had 4 levels that would guide the co-design process, which you can see on this diagram here. And I want to focus really on the first level, which is laying the foundations, because this is perhaps the most important level. And this is where the co-design process starts and the actors come together. And the first thing really is it considers who should be involved. So which stakeholders need to be involved in the co-design process. And are there any hard to reach groups that haven't been involved that should be? I mean, it's also important at this stage to be very clear about what we mean by co-design and co-management, so everyone is clear about what to expect and that we don't raise false expectations. And this might involve setting realistic boundaries over what is achievable. So policymakers and regulators still have got some statutory obligations that they have to meet. So we need to be very clear about what the boundaries of that co-design will be. We can't just be completely releasing the reins. There also needs to be a shared vision, so being very clear about what the goals for co-management and co-design are, and to identify areas of mutual interest and benefit. The rules of engagement need to be developed and very clear, and any formal institutional arrangements that can clearly map out the objectives of the co-design process and the responsibility of all actors would be needed. And this phase takes time, and it's important to get it right before moving on to the other stages. In the case of the survey development, the following phases, in this diagram here, are collecting, analysing, and then using the data from a social survey. But again, this would be done collaboratively with all actors to ensure they all have access to and can use the data in a meaningful way. So it's not just involving stakeholders at the beginning to design the survey and then that's it. It's ensuring that they can use the outcomes of that as well. And then finally, there's a feedback phase to ensure that any learnings from the process are fed back into the early stages. And we adapted this framework in a recent project with NEF that looked at developing the principles for low impact fishing. And in it, what we found was that while stakeholders were initially quite sceptical and concerned that anything they said might be used to reduce their access to fishing opportunity, what was really critical and really key in this was the presence of an open dialogue with key DEFRA personnel. And they had to be very willing to acknowledge past mistakes by policymakers and convey a real ambition and a real desire to work with stakeholders for the best outcomes on both sides. And by the end of the project, although it was difficult and it was cut short by COVID, unfortunately, stakeholders were much more engaged and they were freely sending us emails with their thoughts and wanted to continue beyond the scope of the project. They wanted to continue those discussions. So that was really positive. Just to sum up really and to conclude, I think we've got a real opportunity right now as the UK exits the EU to commit to a new interactive governance model for UK fisheries based on the principles of co-management and co-design. But applying a co-design approach to fisheries is going to take time. It's not going to be easy. It will require refinement of the frameworks, such as the one I've just talked about. They're going to need to be tested and piloted in very practical situations, with all actors recognising that it probably won't be perfect the first time. It's going to require work to agree on the principles for co-management and co-design, and to develop a very practical and operationalised framework can be operationalised for putting those principles into practice. I'll hand over now to Matt, and he will speak more about our experience on a specific project looking at the participation of fishers in science and management. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
And sorry about all the chaos with the slides.
No, I think we're all learning at this stage, so that's absolutely fine. It doesn't seem as though there are that many questions in the chat, so let's continue straight through with Matt's presentation and have the questions at the end.
Thank you, Julie. I'm hoping you can see my screen, and if I don't have any notes, so you won't be seeing those. Just to say that this is the first time that this project has been presented in public. It's being prepared. It is literally in a queue waiting for publication, and we will return as soon as we are able to sort of talk about this in more detail, because I'm very conscious it's a very brief amount of time to talk about it now. But this is a whistle-stop overview, which will give you an idea of what we've been talking to the policymakers about over the last year. And I just want to reassure everybody who's contributed to this, because I'm very conscious that people were very generous with their time and their information and maybe haven't heard anything since, that we have made sure that the policy colleagues have been paying attention to this, and we've shared it as widely as we can with those groups, and we're looking forward to sharing it with people in more detail as soon as we are able. So that's where we are. The team who worked on this were myself, Paul Courtney, Nick Lewis, Hannah Chiswell, Jasmine Black, Julie Urquhart, Richard Freeman at Newcastle, and Jeremy Phillipson, and I'm sure I've just forgotten somebody, but it was quite a team, and we went all over England and engaged a great number of people. So what we're trying to do is understand individual perspectives and experiences of engaging in the management and policy of fisheries across England. The novelty in this project is that, as well as those people who make a living from the sea and are engaged in that way, we also got hold of and worked with recreational anglers and people involved in fishing representative organisations and the national policy arena. The data was collected between April and July last year, so it was an intense burst, captures in some senses that moment, but we hope that it pushes further and deeper to say something more applicable across the piece. As Julie was saying, this is part of a series of investments made by DEFRA, and we are working with ideas of social capital, what we've described as the ladder of participation, which is that you start at a very low level of engagement and you work up to a full co-responsibility. That's really important in thinking about how we co-manage fisheries and also in the co-production of knowledge. And I would always say, for those people who are not familiar with the literature of fishing and the experience of fishing, is that actually it speaks to so many things about how we manage shared resources, how we manage our shared environment, how policy is operated and orientated. And so we can learn an awful lot in this domain, even if we're not particularly engaged with the actual marine environment. Julie's already spoken about the policy framework, but within the white paper is a call for greater inclusion of fishers and anglers, and we're very interested in their role in data collection. So that's the orientation. This is just very quickly. We went to 5 locations: Brighton, North Shields, Plymouth, Scarborough and Weymouth. We did field work there, talking to fishers, talking to people on the ground, had some really fantastic collaboration with people and learnt some amazing things from people in those locations. We also did an online survey of sea anglers, which is all of the dots you can see are the postcodes of the people who participated in the online survey. And just a quick scan of that will tell you that most of those people were on the coast, but not exclusively. So sea angling is not just about those people who live next to the coast, it's also about those people engaged but live further away, which I think is really helpful to think about. And we were just thrilled that we had over 500 people participated, and if we'd run the survey for longer, we would have got more people. So that's a really encouraging set of data there. The report is structured around 10 questions. We do not bring any conclusions in this report, so there's no summative element. So we are looking at this through these lens of these questions. First question is, what extent did individual fishers and anglers and those who represent them perceive fishery science and management to be participatory. Broadly, they didn't tend to see it as particularly participatory. Only 15% of the anglers reported that they'd ever been asked their opinions about marine management, and a similar number had taken part in science projects. Those people who made a living through fishing, there were more people who had participated, but they didn't see it as particularly participatory. Interestingly, those people who work at a national level perceived it to be more participatory, which may suggest that there's a kind of angle of participation there. Second question was, there are participatory bodies built into the management structure of fisheries, and how did people perceive those? Generally, they were not perceived well. Organisations like the Marine Management Organisation and the local conservation authorities were not perceived well. That tended to be patchy because there were areas where there were good local relationships, but generally, again, those people on the ground didn't see it as particularly participatory. Again, national stakeholders saw it as more so. Part of what we were seeing is also, as Julie sort of suggested, fisheries have a long history of people being mistrustful, of difficult experiences and poor relationships between people. So when we came to ask them about their experiences and awareness of partnership working, that is exactly what we found reflected in this. So we've got this is partly characterized by very limited experience. People have had limited chance to collaborate and work together. But they tended to be characterized by feelings of low trust. This quote here perhaps helps us. The problem is, rather than working together, the fishermen view the IFCAs and the Marine Management Organisation as the enemy, and the IFCAs and the MMO view the fishermen as villains, and so is pulling at either direction. Anglers were a little bit more optimistic, but as this quote suggests, there's always this perception that when you're being consulted, it's a prelude to a greater restriction. And so again, this idea that there's low levels of trust runs throughout the research. Question D is whether people want more participation. And I think that's a really important question, because in an area of high conflict and perhaps low trust, we might think that people have given up. We found that there was a strong desire to take part, both by fishers and anglers. The quantitative element is here, but over half of those people we interviewed had a very strong desire to take part more, and nearly 40% of those people online had a very strong desire to participate more. When we found people who didn't want to take part, and we were able to ask them why they didn't want to participate, they had the sense that participation was futile and that there really was no point in taking part. In the full report, we are able to go into that in some greater detail, but certainly there are groups of people who are very disengaged. So if you could overcome some of those feelings, perhaps we'd see higher levels of desire to participate. Anglers in particular were very strong in their way in which they wanted to take part. In boxes on the survey where they were able to sort of elaborate on why they wanted to take part. Out of the 529 people who took part, 364 people left comments about this. So I take this as a strong desire to take part. And it's very interesting that many of the anglers self-identified as conservationists and also want to represent their sport to others and in the management of fisheries. So there's a strong desire out there for participation. The next question is to whether, what form of participation do we want? I think many of us in many kind of forms of community research have seen a certain fatigue with consultation, and a growing skepticism perhaps towards some forms of participatory mechanisms. We were able to sort of do quite a number of bits of interviewing and survey work that started to pick up a picture of how people currently participate and in what they participate in that perhaps helps us here. Very few people we talked to were members of national organisations. So that was one of the things that was very interesting, in that, of course, much of the framework of participation is characterised, certainly in England, at the national level, whereas very few people we communicated with were members of national organisations, but they did tend to belong to local groups. And local groups are really important. Part of this relates to the diversity that Julie was mentioning, that actually our coastlines and the ecosystems of our coastlines are very diverse, and people identify with and fish and angle in particular areas rather than a generic national envelope. They're very happy with those local groups and tend to see them as very effective. Anglers in particular are very keen to take part in formal representations or in the whole management picture. Part of that is that they've been not able to do so previously, so there's a pent-up demand for this. And also the areas in which people engage are really important, the modalities, in that we didn't get very far with the survey until we went onto Facebook. And once we went into Facebook, we were able to find where anglers self-organise and the areas in which they present and represent themselves to each other. So that's a really important thing to think about, is where is the space socially in which people want to participate. Further to that, we, and I don't for a moment suggest that you're going to be able to break down these tables in a Zoom call, but what we were able to do through the questions that we asked in the survey was compare some of the markers of social capital held by anglers to the national levels of social capital. And the anglers come out as possessing more social capital than the average person. So to break that down in pragmatic terms, these are people who are able and more able to participate than the average person, which again shows a latent demand and a latent capability of participation. Next question is people's perceptions of the capacity of organisations representing anglers and fishers to facilitate these kind of ways of participating. And what we found was that actually, because people have very low levels of membership of this, partly this is a sort of strategic investment, in that they don't see much point in participating at a national level. They don't have any misgivings particularly about those national organisations. It's not that they're alienated from those organisations. The NFFO is the National Federation of Fishermen's Organisations that people are talking about here. So this person at the top has been a member for 5 years, but has had nothing to do with them. But they don't worry about that. That's, again, a feeling that people are not concerned about that. It's more about the practical and personal help that these national organisations can bring. They don't have great expectations of them at a national level, which again may reflect their feelings about the overall policy process. What were the perceived barriers to effective participation in the opinion of individual fishers and anglers? These we've sort of summed up here, but cultural barriers. This is really, really important, in that these cultural barriers are social and physical. Literally, often decision makers are physically very distant from the people that we're talking about. We're talking about people who live in coastal communities, work at sea, are a long way from the decision-making centres. Social distance is also really important, and it's something that perhaps we could talk about at greater length, but there still remains a great cultural barrier between how decisions are made by policymakers and also by scientists, really importantly, by scientists and the people working at sea. These include things like certainly commercial fishing and also angling are oral cultures in which people like to talk rather than write. It is not that they're not capable of writing, it's that they prefer to speak. And also images are really important over text, which when we look at policy is actually driven an awful lot by numbers, an awful lot by abstracted formal reporting. Those two things put us in barriers. There are very low levels of trust. I'd have to say that when we work in fishing, I am always surprised to meet people who have been on the wrong end of regulation so often. And there are low levels of reciprocity that really characterize this area, often make it challenging for us to conduct research in because people don't want to talk to us. There's high assumptions that whatever we're doing is really about just restricting their operations, which feeds into the next point, a suspicion of motives. But actually, many of the people on the ground are very suspicious of what the people in charge of policy are doing and why they're doing it, which again relates to trust, but it's slightly separate. Also, we challenge, or the people we spoke to challenge the assumption of the importance of national policy. National policy makers and those engaged in national policy tend to think that it's more important than it is to the operation of many people's businesses. And I think that's really important. So we have to think about that quite carefully, that we assume all of the time that national policy is the most important thing in the operation of these people's businesses and the pursuit of their recreation. It may not be. The next question is to understand any systematic patterns such as geography, position in the industry that might be related to forms and desires for change in participation. We identify angling clubs as really important assets and really important ways in which both it focuses anglers' desires to participate and also their capability. There's a big focus or a focus on local community assets and relationships. Relationships are really important in brokering participation, and there isn't necessarily a facilitation of those. Having said that, we have seen some fantastic examples of local action groups or flags, fishing local action groups, who are doing fantastic work, but they are not as common or thoroughgoing as we would hope. And we identify a series of strategies, particularly amongst fishers, of how they accommodate themselves to the policy environment, which we think will be helpful in understanding why people do and do not participate. So where and how can people kind of be engaged with the process of how people can be brought towards this? We certainly found that most people who are involved in angling actually think that they know a lot about fish and fishing. And that might be a place where we could start to engage people to actually talk about this and engage their expertise. The second question, and this is the lower chart, is that we ask people, what would encourage you to take part in a project? How would we engage you with science? And the most important thing that's really important as to think this through is tell me how it is going to make a difference. People need to know that their participation is going to be consequential to them and be taken seriously. If you look at all the way down the bottom, so nearly 60% of people say, tell me how this is going to make a difference. That would encourage me to participate. Only just over 10% of people say, pay me. So the importance is to allow people to do something that's significant and meaningful to their activities, rather than pay them or incentivize them in other ways. Final slide. What do people on the ground, how do we understand what would encourage people to take part in partnership working, in the view of the fishers and the anglers, and take part? We suggest that in the current environment, it's not necessarily rational to invest in the relationships around policy. People tend to find that they don't get enough from it. And so actually, it's not that people are behaving irrationally, they're actually behaving really rationally. So we need to create an environment where it's rational to invest in relationships. We think, and people on the ground would tend to think, that community development is really important, and often point to the role of flag officers as brokers within that. Lots of people look towards locally negotiated agreements, and so what are, rather than nationally negotiated agreements, something that is within the sphere and area in which they work. I'll just reinforce my point about an oral culture and understanding what that means. Reciprocity and accountability, just to be very, very brief, certainly most fishermen are incredibly accountable through all sorts of accountability systems, and can be inspected and overflown by aircraft and tracked and traced in all sorts of ways. We're not sure that that reciprocity works in the other direction, and that would be an important thing in building trust. And then finally, recognition of expertise, that fishers and anglers know an awful lot about the marine environment, but currently there is a bit of a confusion around concepts such as citizen science, which slightly confuse crowdsourcing data with actual participation by people who have rights and responsibilities. So yes, so thank you. This has been an absolute whistle-stop tour. I've slightly gone over time, a couple of moments, I think. We will be talking about this more. We will publish it on the website when we get a chance. But hopefully that gives you a very quick overview of what we found, and we'll be very happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Matt, and thank you, Julie, beforehand. You've got a fantastic list of comments and questions here. I think if we go back to the beginning when Julie was talking, the first question seems to come from Charlotte about how has co-production looked so far? Has a diverse cohort of fishermen been involved, or has it largely been the bigger fisheries who have more capacity to engage? That's a question for you, Julie.
I think it depends on the context. So there's some examples actually of smaller scale fishers, sort of more regionally getting involved in co-management processes. There's also examples where the larger sector have come together as well and collaborated on science. So it really depends on the case that you're looking at. I think what's missing is kind of an overarching framework or principles for what's best practice in terms of how we might go about co-production or co-design, really. There's lots of examples out there where it's been tried and tested, but bringing that all together, I think, would be useful.
Thank you. Just scrolling down, there's a question from Adam for you as well, I think, who says, I was wondering if the literature discusses whether the potential effectiveness of participatory governance is determined by the level of economic development of the country in which it is used.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that.
No, I wonder if there's been any research on it.
Yeah, I mean, there is some papers that have come out which have suggested that the effectiveness of governance generally in relation to fishing and fisheries is to a degree dependent on the level of economic development, because the policy framework in less developed countries, for example, don't even have a definition for recreational fishing. and also there's more of a blurring between sort of small-scale commercial fishing and recreational fishing itself. So often they're both. So generally, what that literature is saying is that in less economically developed countries, the likelihood of effective governance generally is lower than what it would be in a more developed country. And I was just wondering whether anything around participatory governance mentions this element, the economic development or economic status of the country. But yeah, I'm reading around a lot of this at the moment, so maybe I'll answer my own question in a week or so.
Good, yes.
Like you're the expert on it, Adam.
Well, not yet.
Yeah.
Sorry, I should introduce myself. I'm Adam. I'm about to start PhD research with Julie around recreational sea fishing and motivations amongst anglers and so on. So yeah, I'm at the start of this process.
Great.
Just to add to what Adam said, I think there are some really good examples in the literature of where successful co-management for small-scale fisheries in less developed countries has worked very well. And there is quite a lot of literature on that. And I guess that in areas where governance is difficult, those sorts of initiatives can be quite successful. And more sort of devolved forms of governance where local groups of stakeholders actually take on more responsibility for managing those resources, often in terms of it's been very extractive, because if it's operated on a subsistence level, it can be quite destructive to those environments. But if then the fishers sort of can see that actual sustainable management of that will have benefits for the long term, that can have benefits. So there's some really good examples in the literature on those sorts of things.
Good.
Right.
Thanks.
Just moving down, there's a comment from you, Janet. You might want to explain it in response to one of Julie's slides, saying, or the type of policy, whether it involves mainly regulatory mechanisms or lots of money.
That's exactly what I wanted to say. I think rather than whether the communities themselves are wealthy and powerful or poor, where I think Julie's right, there are examples of all sorts. I think there can be an issue where what you're talking about is carving up a large pot of money, where participatory approaches become much more sensitive. And certainly that's my experience in thinking about agricultural policy, where on one side you've got the potential for participatory approaches and lots of people wanting to get involved, but on the other you've got this great tension about fairness and about how the pot gets divided up, which can work against a kind of very open approach in this way, and the sort of trust relationships with policymakers then become very different if you're talking about somebody's fundamental livelihood, because they're getting at the moment a very large slug of money from the public purse for what they do.
I think it's perhaps slightly different for fisheries because there's no subsidies for fishing as there are in agriculture. So maybe the context is slightly different.
Shall we move on to some questions from Kelly then, Kelly Parsons. A few questions from me on the policymaker side. What was your experience of the motivation of policymakers for this kind of approach? And how were the more sensitive aspects, i.e. policymakers admitting past mistakes, handled? And there's a third question as well, which I'll say in a minute.
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. The policymakers very open to this approach. They're commissioning work with this specifically in mind. Whether they know what they've let themselves in for is another matter, but there certainly is ambition and willingness on the part of policymakers to get involved in this. It is, as I said in the presentation, it is an ambition for the new policy that co-management and participation will be a key part of that policy and the way how things are managed in the future. So there is a real sort of buy-in from policymakers. In terms of your second question, how were the more sensitive aspects, i.e. policymakers admitting past mistakes, handled? This very much comes down to individual personnel within DEFRA or whatever institution that you're talking about. So having somebody who is happy to stand up in front of a room full of, I won't say angry, but frustrated and challenged fishers, and say, yeah, hold my hands up. We have made mistakes in the past. You've had a bit of a rule with it. We know that, but we're here now. We're talking to you now, and we want to hear what you have to say. We want to take that on board, and we want to move forward with you. Having somebody who is able to do that is absolutely critical. So it does come down very much to certain key individuals in institutions, I think. And what was the other one?
The third point was about findings and lessons being shared across other government departments.
Do you mind if I interrupt?
Yep.
Sorry, Julie, it's Steve Matheson. Do you think those individuals exist? I totally agree with what you said, but do you think they exist at the present time?
I've had experience of somebody who did just that in the last project that we were involved in. But yes, I do agree that they are few and far between.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I agree with you, Julie, that those individuals do exist. I think that the difficulty is that as a policy response, if we are down to people behaving in a very capable way within their policy role, that may also suggest other areas of policy failure, in that we're asking people to go beyond what the policy role is, which suggests there are still some other problems. I would sort of more point to maybe a Weberian analysis, that there are certainly people within this system who want it to be different and are doing their best to make it different. But there are sort of structural problems up and down of power, accountability, and people who benefit that are yet to be addressed. And you know, I would look to some of the institutions of science that perhaps need to look to themselves in a different way, and some of the roles of lower level bureaucracies who have shifted responsibility or wiggle away from accountability. So yes, there are people who are trying, but there are still systemic problems.
Can I just come in to talk to Julie about the questions I asked?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm a research fellow at the University of Hertfordshire. I work on food policy, if people don't know me. Julie, can I just ask you about the motivations? Did you get the impression that it was because it was some kind of, not a diktat, but like a policy, a government policy to involve people? Was there evidence that they'd seen that this was a good approach, or that it's just trendy, or were they actually expecting to improve the policy making for any particular reason by involving people in it?
I think there's recognition that things haven't worked well in the past, and there is an ambition to do better in the future, and recognise that the only way to do that is to engage with stakeholders and to collaborate with stakeholders to understand their perspectives and involve them in those decisions. And I do, for the policymakers that I've dealt with, I do get a sense of a genuine, it's not just a diktat from on high because it's in the white paper that we need to do this, so therefore we'll do it. I do think there is a step change actually in the approach that I'm seeing from DEFRA anyway around this. I don't know if others would agree with that.
That's really interesting, thank you.
Okay, I'm conscious of the time, and maybe we should be moving on to some questions about Matt's presentation now. There's lots of comments there, Julie, if you want to look at those and maybe engage in bilateral conversations with various people. But if we move on to some questions, and I think this is concerned Matt's from Bryony. To what extent does the higher cultural capital potentially overlap with higher financial capital? are anglers people who can afford to be anglers, for example?
Sea angling, yeah, I mean, recreational sea angling is a very varied thing. We are talking about some people who just have a very cheap fishing rod and stand at the end of the pier, and other people who own a purpose-built boat for it. And so it is a very varied thing. The findings that we had were of such a sustained level that the people participating in recreational sea angling seemed to be a fairly broad group of people who had quite high social capital through their engagement with their angling club, and not necessarily having high social capital in other areas of their lives. So there may be more analogous to the general kind of pursuit of sport, or however it is. But of course, the difference maybe is that in recreational sea angling, although it's kind of physically challenging at times, it's not like sort of playing rugby until you're in your 50s, where there's a kind of tapering off of participation. You can actively participate for a long time. So yes, it's not just about wealthier groups. There are people who have some pretty high levels of social capital developed, I would hypothesize, through sea angling, but they've not yet been really included in the policy process.
Okay, I'm going to carry on with a few more questions. Katerina, would you mind just looking at the latter messages and pulling out any key questions? Because we've now got 21 new messages, I see, and I don't think we have to cover all of them. Mm-hmm. The next question probably overlaps with what you were just talking about, Matt, but the perceived barriers dividing between the two groups, the fishers and the anglers, must be very different groups. This is a comment from Janet. And their perceived barriers. Yeah,
they are different groups in some ways, but there is a conversation that goes on between the two groups. Partly that's because often they're sharing an interest. You know, they'll be fishing in a harbour, they'll be using a charter boat that's run by a fisher, those kind of things. So these are not two subsets of people who are mutually exclusive. Having said that, again, this relates to the diversity of commercial fishing. Many commercial fishers are maybe running a super trawler or something like that. Most anglers would feel very, very opposed to. Their local inshore day boat, they would feel a lot of empathy with and a lot of sympathy with. So I think there's those questions there. And there's also maybe an appreciation that most of the anglers appreciated that this was their recreation. They may take a few fish occasionally to eat, but actually a lot of them returned their fish once they caught them. So they did understand the difference between making a livelihood and their recreation. So there was some grounds for fellow feeling. Equally, there were grounds for opposition, and there are flashpoints. There are, because obviously the anglers want to catch something. And for many of them, that's clearly becoming a bit of a challenge. Catching anything is challenging.
There's a question from Beth Dooley, which is for both of you really, wondering about conflicts between language communication around knowledge and experience, and how understanding between these different knowledge systems can be built. Looks like, Matt, you're going to pass that one over to Julie.
No, I'm
expression on your face.
That's absolutely right. The language is extraordinarily different. But what I would say is that we just need to be careful on each side to make sure that we avoid stereotypes in what is quite a conflicted situation. I've seen I've seen fishers at a meeting with scientists produce a brilliant critique of their whole methodology and their hypotheses, and could actually they could actually constructively criticize a marine science project, but they didn't use the language of marine science. And I think that some of the building a consensus around language is really important, and language is really fraught here. Are we talking about fish stocks, fish populations? Are we talking about resource management, or are we talking about environmental management? These sort of subtle differences are really important. And equally, you know, both anglers and fishers seem to have a great regard for competence and achieving things, whereas experimentation, either in governance or in science, doesn't always lead to the outcomes. And it's kind of mutual understanding of those things. I'm sure Julie's got, because I know Julie's been thinking a lot about this, she's got things to say.
No,
okay.
I'll leave it there, but I think Chris Williams just wanted to say something, if there's time for him to have a final comment.
Yes, Chris has had his hand up and had a chat.
Yeah, I think he's not online. Well, he's
maybe he had to go.
Has he gone? Oh well.
Let's just go quickly then to Jasmine's comment about how do we work, what more work do we do in understanding exactly what happens to these sorts of results, as well as those from farming sector surveys once they're fed back into DEFRA, and what happens to them when they're in the policy forming environment.
What is the question, the exact question?
How can we do more to make sure these results are fed back and used effectively in the policy making environment?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I think, yeah, we prepare a report and DEFRA use it as they will. We try to have ongoing conversations about the outcomes of our report, and we try to encourage it to be spread more widely within DEFRA. And we also think it's really important that we feed back any outcomes from projects back to stakeholders as well. I think that's really crucial, that they see what the outcomes of their participation in those projects are, rather than just us going in, getting information from them and then forgetting about them. So we try to produce summaries of our findings that are accessible, that we can then share more broadly. But yeah, it's limiting in terms of what we do with policymakers. There is a process that you go through, and actually even getting a report published is a very long-winded process, as Matt is pulling his teeth out, has been recently with the fisheries one. It just takes months and months, as we all know. So yeah, that is a real challenge. I agree.
Yeah, I think so. I think that, I mean, obviously as researchers and social science researchers, we have maybe a particular role and responsibility. And I was very struck by the Food and Farming Commission's kind of injunction to stay with it. That actually, as researchers, sometimes we get the opportunity to hang out in this space for longer than some of the people involved in policy. So we're more like those people who make their living directly from it. And I'm very conscious that, say, Paul, Julie and I and Nick 10, 12 years ago were doing field research about inshore fishing that fell out of kind of fashion with the policy makers. But, 10 years later, we were able to return to that. And although we couldn't do so formally as part of the methodology, we did actually speak to some of the same people and revisited some of the same topics. So, we have a role in kind of holding that institutional memory almost. And I think also there's a joke, isn't there, that policy, two things you shouldn't see in life made, sausages and policy, and actually, as an advocate for knowing what's in your sausage, I think you should also know what's in your policy, and policy making should be less opaque and more transparent. And we need to kind of have discussions and encourage people that actually policy making and discussions as such are transparent and open, including the limitations of policy. Policy can only do so much. Many of the people we talk to are struggling to make a living because they're struggling to get as much value and profit as they can from whatever it is they do. Policy has a role in that, but often that's very indirect. So when we talk to them about policy, it's not necessarily the most urgent question they're facing. And and equally, policymakers need to be very honest as to, I can make a difference to your business in this or your livelihood in this, but I've got nothing to say about these other things. And I think that's really, what I would suggest. We focus on and hanging in here for as long as we can, subject to the investments and opportunities we're given.
Okay. Katerina, I'm not sure if you managed to have a quick look at the other questions.
Yes, I did. And I think most of it has been sort of addressed.
Okay.
And there were specific questions about whether in the surveys, the fishers and anglers, people really understood things like participation, co-design and co-management, or whether the understanding varied. So that was one of the questions from Anna.
Oh yeah. Understanding really varied. So from people who really had a very rudimentary understanding of what this was about, but really wanted to take part, because I think, as Nick has sort of suggested, we are talking about folks who are really, really passionate. If you make your life as a fisher, you really want to go to sea, because there are lots of easier ways of making a living. If you just want to make money than going out and risking your life on a boat. And recreational anglers are a particularly passionate bunch about what they do too. It's a very big part of their identity. So they understood that. Equally, some of the people who took part are very experienced about policy, very experienced in different areas of policy, not necessarily in this, but they really understood what it meant. So it's about sort of unleashing that capacity. And we were very privileged on occasion to see groups of fishers in discussion with one another and with others. And so, yeah, we have a spectrum of sophistication, but we certainly got people who would be very capable of taking up some of these roles.
I think, sorry, thanks for your answer. It was just to clarify though. I think
No.
My question was more around actually like whether people really, whether you got a sense of whether there was a difference between how people wanted to participate in maybe science or data collection versus like decision making versus like maybe the management and enforcement, because they're quite different things, and obviously everyone might understand very different parts. So I don't know whether you got a sense of.
Yeah, separately, people want to be heard and want to be accounted for, so they have a sense of what they want to participate. Most of the fishers feel that they should be involved in routine data collection, so that they really would like to think that more data is gathered from what they do, and then having seen them sort of discuss some of the higher level concepts, they would probably like to be involved in framing some of the research questions, but we don't have a language for that yet. So in a sense, what I think we're looking forward to is constructing something. The thing that we're trying to describe is in process. We're trying to describe something that doesn't quite yet exist, which is a kind of marine ecological citizenship where people are accountable and participate to one another and create these kind of new things together, so they co-own them. So it's not that we're going to inhabit a house somebody else built. We're going to build this house together.
Sounds like a good moment to end. I think we've lost Chris. Is Chris there? He wanted to comment on some work that he's been doing with CCRI. Okay, another time. Excellent. Many, many thanks. Very good, stimulating presentations. Thanks, both of you. And as I say, do look at the chat, and it might stimulate some more conversations. And
the chat be saved?
Yes. Yeah.
Great.
And the